is Denis Topal, who's going to be talking to us about ceremonial swords and daggers of early nomads of Eurasia. Anyway, Denis,
Thank you a lot. Yeah, it's hard to be the first after the lunch, but I will do my best not to bore you too much. So, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, first I would like to thank all the organizers for kindly inviting me for this important event. You are great, it's a real pleasure. So I'd like to draw your attention on to one very few, it's slightly more than 50 exemplars, but the very bright category of the material culture of early nomads. I'm referring on the so-called ceremonial swords and daggers of the early Iron Age, of the steppe belt of Eurasia. So the Russian scholars are using more often the term parade swords, but not in the sense of military parades that early nomads probably didn't have, but rather in the same sense as parade entrance or parade portrait, like front door or ceremonial portrait, as something very special, solemn, and rich decorated. This term means weapons decorated with precious metals, most often gold. It is known that gold for the Scythians, as probably for all Iranians, was a very special metal, and it probably symbolized so-called hvarna, a sort of spiritual force, the military luck, or in other words, charisma of a warrior. For example, the main warriors of Achaemenid Empire, I mean the Persian kings, they used golden swords, or swords decorated with gold, as a royal gifts on special occasions. We know it very well from sources like Herodotus, Xenophon, or Lucian from Samosata. In Scythian milieu, the sword is the embodiment of the god of war, it's known. Probably the only one of the Scythian pantheon to whom Scythians brought human sacrifices, built the altars, also according to Herodotus, and whose name was Tebu. So probably that was the principal god in Scythian pantheon. I'd like to begin by suggesting that weapons are one of the most sensitive indicators of the cultural changes of ancient societies. Apparently, therefore, the emergence of nomadism in the beginning of the first millennium BC turned the nomadic weaponry into the subcultural phenomena. Here you can see the main concentrations of Scythian swords and daggers. That's obvious that the special place in the culture of the early nomads is occupied by the so-called ceremonial forms of swords and daggers. There are known at least 53 items from 42 locations, so okay, known for me, but this is approximately 2.5% of all of the total number of swords and daggers of early nomads from late 8th till late 4th century BC, or in other words, every 40th sword or a dagger of Scythian time from the territory of Silesia to northern China. So here you could see the distribution, the European area of distribution of Scythian swords and daggers. So what I'm going to do is outline in very general terms the main characteristic of the findings of these ceremonial blade arms of the early nomads of Eurasia. I have divided my talk in 3 main sections. So that would be chronology, functional identity, and context. I'd like to start from the context. So unlike the other swords, you see here the European area. So the ceremonial swords geographically distributed rather unevenly. One unique find comes from the territory of Iran, one from the Balkans, and one from Central Europe. 4 groups of 3 items are known from the territory of Ciscaucasia, the Urals, Central Asia, and Altai. 5 are known for southern Siberia, but the bulk, the 39 items, 39 swords and daggers, this is almost 3/4 or 73%, comes from the northern Black Sea area, so from steppe zone 23, items for steppe 11, and from Crimea 5. Almost all of the finds are associated with funeral complexes, mainly aristocratic burials, and without any exception, okay, with one exception from Arjan II, are connected with male burials. Only one sword, a scabbard and a chape, were found in hoards. That famous hoard from famous treasure from Veterswerde, actual Poland, Zivie, Iran, and Oxus treasure from modern Tajikistan. You could notice that these hoards are located on the periphery of civilian world, and I don't think that's accidental. 2 more sword finds and a scabbard don't have the reliable archaeological context. I mean the 2 finds from Crimea, from Chayan, and probably from Kerch, and 1 find from Altai, from Kluchi, Tymensova district. But at least 2 of them from Crimea would be associated with disturbed burials robbed in 19th century. If we turn to the full sample, it turns out that the Sivian Akinake on the European area are just slightly more than a half associated with burial complexes. So for European area, it's about 620 from 1,000, 620 from 1,000, and about 200 items, so or 54%. And the number of stray finds vary from some regions from 30 to 70%. Of course, the prestigious and ceremonial nature of these swords and daggers makes their connection with the funeral complexes so obvious. That's clear. However, it cannot be ruled out that some of the items were made, or more precisely, I could say that were specially prepared for funerals and were decorated with gold, especially for the funerals. There is a lot of evidence, I think, in the presentation of my colleague Rafael Minasan. He will tell about a lot of techniques, but as I know, for example, that many of them, of these golden leaves of ceremonial swords, that have no scratches, even on the handle. So the gold was fixed on these items shortly before the funeral ceremony. Okay, let's now turn to the functional definition of ceremonial swords and daggers. The interesting thing about them is, are they really swords or just daggers? In general, the division between dimensional groups or functional groups of blade weapons is conditional and relational. So probably the boundary, the limits between these groups changed from one epoch to another. As for civilian weapons, such definition as short sword or long dagger or akinakes, even in archaeological papers, are often interchangeable and mutually complementary terms. But not so long ago I managed to clarify these boundaries. So I made a sort of statistical experiment. Firstly, the analysis of the variation rows of variation series of such features as total length or length of the blade simply show that this series is far from the normal distribution or Gaussian distribution. What could it mean? In my opinion, okay, I suppose the existence of several functional standards, and due to the features of scatter plot, I allocated 5 groups: Daggers with the blade length of up to 21 centimeters, short sword from 21 to 38 centimeters, average swords from 38 to 54 centimeters, long swords and extra long swords with a blade length more than 80 centimeters. Okay, my colleague from Romania would argue this. He supposed that, okay, sword couldn't be less than 40 centimeters. Okay, we could call it Alexander, not just swords, but long daggers. Who cares? Let's turn to ceremonial forms. They are represented by all 5 functional categories, but at the same time they show a slightly different distribution. You see with the orange dots are indicated ceremonial forms. They are represented by all 5 functional categories, but at the same time they show a slightly different distribution. The most part belongs to the group of average swords, from 38 to 54 centimeters, or that's about 50%, and long swords, that's about 27%. In other words, the ceremonial akinake are bigger than ordinary civilian akinake, so they are more swords than daggers. The last but not the least point I wish to deal with is the chronology. What I find most interesting about these golden swords is a curious chronological phenomenon. It could be called the time lag. A vivid example is the handle of Achaemenid sword of probably of the 5th century BC from the Chertomlik barrow of the 3rd quarter of the 4th century BC. So the chronological distance or this time lag would be more about a century. Or the famous Fettersfeld treasure of the late 6th, early 5th century BC. The sword or dagger from Fettersfeld actually represent the initial period of collecting this treasure, while the funeral complexes with similar akinake, they are dated back at least a half a century before the treasure was hidden. Or, for example, the so-called griffin daggers with pommels in the shape of heads of birds of prey or griffins. So they appear in the white spaces of the Scythian world from Danube to the northern China in a very short time. It's middle of the 6th century BC and are known for about a century. But the latest griffin daggers, the latest complexes with that, these griffin daggers are dated back to the 5th and even 4th century BC. I mean the sword from Issyk, which is represented now in the exhibition, and Filipovka. And they are decorated with gold. Another example, it's Saloha type sword with a very specific schematic antenna pommel, so probably also inspired by griffin hats, and they are usually met in the complexes of the late 5th and early 4th century BC, and you will see that the latest burials dated back to the even late 4th century BC with such swords, or contained ceremonial swords, or were dated by scholars with, by analogy with the rich burials. Right. And one more thing about chronology. If we create a histogram of the chronological distribution of such category of items like Scythian akinake, it becomes very clear that In that case, we're dealing with the so-called normal or Gaussian distribution. We could see the symmetrical bell-shaped curve or bell curve with a quantitative maximum in the interval between the last quarter of 6 and the first quarter of 5th century BC. Thus, it can be assumed that the Scythian Echinacus represents a unified tradition from 7th to 4th century BC, so the Echinacus dissolves as a type of weaponry along the disappearance of the classical Scythian culture, because we don't know any Echinacus in the late Scythian culture of 3rd, 2nd centuries BC. There is a relatively big group on the Dniester River or of the 3rd, 2nd centuries BC, and it was excavated about, okay, I guess 200 burials and no one sword of the Scythian types or Scythian origin. I have a point which I'd like to take up. Well, the Echinacus appears with the emergence of early Scythian complex with early Scythian culture, but it is likely that the tradition of decorating swords with gold in nomadic milieu appears shortly before the Scythian Echinacus. So the only one pre-Scythian dagger, or dagger of pre-Scythian type, decorated with gold, dates back to the time not earlier than the middle of the 8th century BC, or probably the late 8th century BC. I mean the dagger from Ptichata Mogila Barrow. It's in Bulgaria, near Belogradets village, so very known pre-Scythian dagger. At the same time, most of the ceremonial swords are associated with the classical Scythian culture, and the peak is connected with the final phase of classical period in the 3rd quarter of the 4th century BC. This period is often called by scholars as the Golden Fall, Golden Autumn of Scythian culture, and this is Golden Autumn of Scythian Echinacus as a tradition or idea. And apparently it's his swan song of this type of swords and daggers. And finally why this small, though a very bright group of objects could become the subject of our consideration. Okay, they're simply beautiful things, and everybody in this hall, they love Scythians, their swords and their gold. It's clear, but I'd like to look at this issue in a bit more detail. In general, there are 3 main approaches to the typology of the blade weapons of Scythian time. Researchers either build their schemes based on the combination of the shape of the pommel, the shape of the hilt, or functional characteristic as a shape of a blade. It's a very traditional and very clear way, but there is another one, a third way, so-called search of cultural types. It is based on the idea of linking typological characteristic with the cultural context, with the need of search of grouping of the things, series of the things that are realized by their bearers. And in my humble and very subjective opinion, such cultural types for the Scythian Echinacus would be revealed with the help of 2 complementary indicators. So one of them is the reflection in the art. In the case of Scythians, it's monumental sculpture and toreutics. And another indicator is the presence of prestigious or ceremonial forms inside of a typological series of items. And if you look at the typological series of the last 10 years, You will be pleasantly surprised. You will see definitions of types with the titles where already exists a reference to the royal burials and golden swords. You will definitely notice Kellerman's type for early Civian period. You will notice Shoemaker and Fettersfelde type. You will notice for the middle period, middle Civian period, that's Griffin daggers. You will see Saloha, Chertomlik, and Shulgovka types for the classical Civian culture. And finally, why could the evolution of the Civian swords and daggers be so clearly visible on the ceremonial objects? Frankly speaking, so the most reasonable answer, I don't know. But probably the golden Akinakis is the concentration of the concept of an ideal sword or a dagger. And now these ancient representations could become a nice base for modern typologies. I'm sorry for my optimism and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I'd like to just begin with an observation. There's one other accumulated example you could consider adding. I don't know if it would qualify. There's one in our collection which is acquired in Egypt in the 1820s, and it's a tamarisk wooden scabbard, which was originally covered with gold leaf. Most of the gold leaf was scraped off for recycling, probably in the 1820s, but we have a little trace of it. And so, of course, it's completely outside. It's at the opposite end of the Scythian interface zone.
No, but it's quite interesting.
Maybe it's the exception that proves the rule. But anyway, I'll just throw that out there for you to consider. Anyway, any questions?
Yes, one question. Why do you think this scabbard in the Vitaskovo or Fettersfelde hoard is the earliest? I presume you are using stylistic criteria inside the hoard.
Not really. Typological.
Okay.
Typologically, this type of source appears about at the beginning of the 6th century BC, and the main complexes are dated back to the about the middle 6th century BC.
Because according to the technical study of Redfern, which you can see actually at the BAR stand, the same tools are used on the fish scabbard and the plates. So it should be the same workshop, and I don't think it would take such a long time to produce these objects.
Okay, that's a very nice question. We don't know when this golden scabbard was made and when the sword was made. If we take into consideration that this treasure represents a robbed Scythian aristocratic burial by somebody, or there is such opinion. Yeah. So we don't know when these golden leaves were put or fixed on this sword. Yeah. But the type, Fettersfelde type, dates back to the second quarter of 6th and third quarter, late 5th century, late 6th century BC. So it could be earlier, definitely.
You mentioned that 3 hoards were found at the periphery of the Scythian areas, Wettersburg, Zivier, and the Oxus, and this was no accident. Could you expand on that, please? They were the only hoards, sir.
Yeah, I understand this question. Probably the Scythians have a tradition to decorate their swords for the funerals, and probably in this periphery they had no such traditions, but they have these swords put in hoards. Probably it's another archaeological context connected with another cultural tradition. So, but the question is, yeah, I understand. The question is better than the answer.
I have a question about connecting this to iconography. So I'm wondering whether you've mapped any of the kind of depictions of swords that exist throughout the area that you're looking at. Because just thinking about Iran, and a lot of people have kind of used the Persepolitan reliefs, and there would be swords depicted in those, and whether you've actually been able to connect any of the examples that you have physically of swords with those kinds of iconographic depictions and reliefs and paintings and things like that.
Yeah. Okay, these iconographic, these images of, okay, let's call it cultural types, they are slightly later than the type exists, and I think it's normal. But anyway, all these cultural types could be identified on the monumental sculpture or Turiutics or both of them.
Денис, мой вопрос по поводу мечей типа чертамлык. У них на лезвии длинная прорезь сквозная. Это значит, что эти мечи чисто церемониальные или, ну, видимо, это все-таки ухудшало боевые качества меча, такое изготовление?
So the question is about daggers of Chertomlik types, which had a slit on the blade. Is it just a ceremonial feature? Probably it could make it worse in terms of function.
Yeah, thank you, I see. Okay, no, the only ceremonial feature of Chertomlik swords is golden leaf fixed on the handle. But these openings on the blade, they appear not only on the ceremonial swords. I don't know, there is idea, I'm not very good with warrior tactics, but there is an opinion that these openings are for, I don't know, to balance the blade or something. But by the way, this tradition to make these openings appears a little bit earlier, on the beginning of the classical period. And as I know, on the east of this main European region of distribution of Scythian Akinake, okay, they have these openings not only in the blade, but in the handles too. So that's quite interesting phenomenon. Probably it's for balancing the sword.
Could I ask you this word Akinake, what language is that and what does it mean precisely? I'm afraid I'm not familiar with it at all. Thank you.
You know, Nobel Prize is not given for archaeologists, but the scholar who will answer on this question will deserve it definitely. There are a lot of opinions, yeah. The main probably is with Iranian connection, but I don't know. But the last one, my colleague from St. Petersburg, Kulanda, he supposed that that comes from Caucasian languages. So it means something to cut, or I don't know, I'm not very sophisticated in linguistics, I just retranslate his opinion. So probably Iranian, probably Caucasian, probably neither of them.
All right, thank you.
I just want to make a completion on the etymology of the word Akinake. Indeed, there is the opinion that the word is Iranic in origin, but all the scholarship I read on this matter concluded that the word for sure is not Iranic. And there are two directions of research. More recently has appeared an opinion that the word could in fact be from the Greek language. I personally don't believe so, because the area of distribution of the object is much larger than the northern Black Sea, and it's very hard to believe that a word from the Greek colonies could have went so far in such a large distance being adopted by the Scythians. And even so, Herodotus himself mentions that the word Akinakai is of foreign origin. And in regard to what Sergei Kulanda wrote, he is a researcher at the Oriental Institute of St. Petersburg, if I remember well, he says that in the Caucasian languages, more exactly in the language group, the Nakh language group, in which modern Sasanian languages, the word Akinakai might come from Egineg, which means in Sasan languages and Nakh languages, iron dagger. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
One last question.
Yes, I appreciated very much your statistics and diagrams, including the circular. We call them camembert in French. But my question is that, as we can, all of us can imagine, all the intensity of the looting in the past is different according to the time period and the areas, and the intensity of the archaeological research is also very different. So, what confidence do you put in these statistics?
I don't know. Sorry?
No. Just what confidence can you?
Okay. I'm not very. Okay, and do not believe all I see in the statistical diagrams or histograms. So I have a lot of skepticism about it. But anyway, the statistic could show us some abnormal features of the objects. Yeah, and if you really work with huge databases, so some abnormal activity of the things, of the evolution could be revealed. I don't know. That's not an answer? Okay.
Okay, I think we could go on and on, but thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.